This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Sharif Abdel-Quddus. Our guest is Nir Rosen. His book is just out. It's called Aftermath, Following the Bloodshed of America's Wars in the Muslim World. As we turn now to another comment by President Bush. President Bush's memoir is just out. And he talked with Matt Lauer of NBC about that period of heightened sectarian violence in Iraq in 2006 as being the worst time of his presidency.
It was the worst time of my presidency, period. And the reason why is because I thought we were about to lose in Iraq.
So in terms of decision points, how hard a decision was the surge for you? Where does it rank?
Well, it was a very difficult decision.
But the surge did succeed in reducing, if not eliminating, sectarian violence.
Have you been given enough credit, sir, for the success of the surge?
I don't seek it. And
do you think you deserve it?
I think it's an interesting decision that when people analyze it, will say, well, it's an interesting decision he made. The verdict is still out.
So that's President Bush talking about the surge with Matt Lauer. And, of course, General Petraeus is the one who headed up that surge in Iraq. He's now the head commander of NATO and U.S. forces in Afghanistan. President Obama has an effect on his own surge in Afghanistan, sending in 30,000 additional troops. What's your take on what's happening there?
As we see, 2010 is the worst year on record, and violence is getting worse and worse. The Taliban control maybe 80% of the country. And they're spreading in the north, and they're spreading in non-Pushtun groups, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Turkmen, so it's not working. Now, the surge didn't work in Iraq. As I said, it was primarily Sunni and Shia developments, Iraqi developments. But even if the surge worked in Iraq, none of the factors which existed in Iraq exist in Afghanistan. So in Iraq, you had Sunni militias realizing they had lost, and that they were being defeated, and that there was a potential Rwanda of Sunnis that could have happened, and they pushed them to ally with the Americans. The Sunnis in Iraq are 20% of the population, a minority. In Afghanistan, the Taliban are dominated by Pashtuns. It's not a Pashtun movement, but it's dominated by Pashtuns, who are maybe 40% of the population, the largest group. And the Taliban feel like they're winning. The Pashtuns have not been punished at all. Maybe if you were the Russians or the Israelis, you could really massively bombard Pashtun areas and defeat them if you were genocidal. The only successful counterinsurgency in history, really, is Malaya, where the British took 500,000 ethnic Chinese Malayans, moved them from their homes, and put them in concentration camps. And that sort of worked. So if you were insanely brutal, you could do that to the Taliban. Just move all the Pashtuns. Short of that, you don't really have any sign that that's going to work. In addition to that, Prime Minister Maliki developed some kind of legitimacy. A key principle of counterinsurgency is that you want to build the capacity of the government, strengthen it, and spread it throughout the country so it can take over. In Afghanistan, that's the last thing you want to do. The government is predatory, it's corrupt. It's not a beast you want to feed, it's a beast you want to starve.
This is key strategy. He literally wrote the book on counterinsurgency.
Well, he signed his name at the bottom of it. It was really written by hundreds of other guys, all kinds of experts, and maybe he, dotted a few T's and crossed a few I's. But yeah, he's credited with writing the book, certainly. Although these days in Kandahar, we don't even see them engaged in counterinsurgency. It's just a massive kind of military sweep. Now, in Iraq, they called it population-centric counterinsurgency. The theory is you're going to protect the population. But in Iraq, during the surge, the Americans killed at least 3 times as many civilians as they did before the surge, with airstrikes, with kill and capture operations, with terrain denial, using artillery in populated areas sometimes. So the population did not feel protected. Likewise, in Afghanistan, we see civilian casualties continue to be going up. And we're fighting a local movement. We're fighting the Taliban. Al-Qaeda is not in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is in Pakistan. It's in Yemen. It's in internet cafes and slums around the world. So it makes no sense that we have this massive military footprint in Afghanistan where Al-Qaeda isn't, as opposed to Pakistan or Yemen or elsewhere where they are. Not that we should invade Pakistan or Yemen, obviously, but even by our own military logic. What the hell are we doing in Afghanistan? Fighting a local indigenous movement, which is maybe not loved by many people, but is the only grassroots movement with any legitimacy in much of the country, and is spreading. And we're backing a regime which is hated, illegitimate, lacking credibility, oppressing people. The police when they're not doing drugs, are ripping people off at checkpoints, are stealing from people, are switching sides to the Taliban. We talk about reconciliation, trying to get the Taliban on our side. So there was a reconciliation last week in Ghazni province. I think you had the police switching sides to the Taliban. And we're setting up militias now, creating new militias, which historically has been a terrible problem in Afghanistan. There's no sign of progress.
You spent time with the Taliban in Afghanistan. You write about that in the book.
Yeah, some of it was against my will.
Well, explain what happened.
But what I found, the Taliban that I met, and in general, these seem to be the accounts of other people who've met them, are very local. Farmers, villagers, people from the villages where you're meeting them. And they're fighting for very local reasons, not for Al-Qaeda, not for jihad against the Jews and Christians around the world, or any kind of battle until Judgment Day. They're fighting for Afghanistan, for Islam, for revenge, because maybe somebody from that village was killed. They're fighting for local grievances. Perhaps one tribe or one clan is being backed by the Americans in a rivalry with another clan, but they're primarily locals with local leadership. Now, what we are seeing, though, in a shift, Petraeus has had some success in his kill and capture operations targeting mid-level commanders. What that's doing, though, is actually having perhaps a negative effect. These older, more experienced commanders were part of the community, had a relationship with the community could pressure them. Likewise, they dated back to the days of Mullah Omar, and they were responding to a real sort of chain of command. These guys are being killed or arrested. A younger generation is taken over, a generation with less ties to the community. They're beginning to kill or alienate traditional elders and leaders. They're much more radical. And they're also less likely to obey commands of Mullah Omar and the old Taliban leadership. So you're going to have an even harder time trying to negotiate with these people. And you are pushing them into the hands of Al-Qaeda. It's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Taliban are not Al-Qaeda. It's insane. The Taliban have their own hierarchy. It's Afghans in the senior levels, Al-Qaeda, to the extent that it even exists as any kind of movement, has Arabs at the top, not Afghans, or maybe some Pakistanis. They're two separate movements. But by killing more and more of the traditional Taliban leadership, we are going to push them eventually into the hands of Al-Qaeda.
AP has reported scribbled notes from Taliban leader Mullah Muhammad Omar have surfaced in mosques all over Afghanistan's ethnic Pashtun heartland, threatening death to anyone who takes up a government offer to negotiate for peace, according to a longtime Taliban member. Your response, Nir Rosen?
It's only plausible. I mean, in Afghanistan, you never know what's true and what isn't, thanks to the war. I think the Taliban would like to negotiate. I think Petraeus has sort of nixed any possibility of negotiation. He really takes this war very seriously. He's increased the offensive and increased kill and capture operations, going against the own doctrine that he's associated with from Iraq, whether it's true or false. It doesn't matter. But it seems as if they've abandoned counterinsurgency now and are just pushing massively in these clear sweep operations, arresting large numbers of men. I think the Taliban would like to negotiate, but they're going to negotiate from a position of power. And I think the Americans would like to somehow weaken the Taliban momentum so that the Americans feel like they're negotiating from a position of power. But the Taliban are there to stay, and our attention span is going to be limited, a year, 5 years. People talk about 2011 or 2014. We're not going to stay indefinitely. And why are we even there? We're investing so much money in this country, and what's the return for it? To fight the Taliban? The Taliban are going to attack the U.S. with pickup trucks and AK-47s? It just doesn't seem likely. And if the Taliban take over and Al-Qaeda wants to return and set up training bases, even better. You can find them and you can blow them up, as opposed to Pakistan, where there's a much better infrastructure, much more dense urban areas. It's easier for them to integrate. One thing that we're doing, actually, we're pushing Afghanistan's problems into Pakistan, which seems like a terrible idea. So you have insurgents who are who are fleeing into Pakistan, drug networks, and the Taliban, Al-Qaeda that used to be at the border area now are fleeing, thanks to the drone strikes, into Karachi, into Sindh and Punjab. So we're further destabilizing Pakistan, and that's where the real threat might be.
Nir, we have to go, but I wanted to ask you a last question. You write about in the book how you started reporting. You were working here in New York as a bouncer, and you decided to go to Iraq, and you've been one of the premier independent journalists, unembedded, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, across the Middle East. Why did you decide to become a journalist? And you end the book with a punchy critique of the U.S. media. Your assessment as well of that.
I was a bouncer in Washington, yeah, but that wasn't like it was a career with a lot of promise. It was just something temporary. My aspiration had been to be a journalist for quite a long time, and I was increasingly frustrated with the reporting of the build-up to the war in Iraq, where it seemed obvious to me, and to friends who were academics and students who knew the region, that it was just impossible that there were weapons of mass destruction. And we knew that the war was going to go horribly wrong. We could see that the media was very much parroting the American line and was very subservient to the American establishment. And I felt very passionate about it. I had some basic knowledge of the language. I had missed my opportunity in Afghanistan, but I knew Iraq would be my opportunity. And indeed, that proved to be the case. I remain deeply emotionally involved in the country. Friends I've made there in 2003 are the ones who help me now, although every time I go back, I have to erase a few names from my cell phone because they've been killed. And that happened just this last trip a few weeks ago. But I also remain frustrated with the American media, at least the establishment, with few exceptions. You have some very brave and independent journalists. But too often, they seem to return to sort of being the handmaids of power, instead of challenging power, instead of having this adversarial relationship with people in power, realizing that people in power lie. I think that's been the fundamental principle guiding my work. So anybody in power is going to lie to maintain their power. It should be obvious, whether they're a leader of a militia in Baghdad or whether they're the leader of the free world. And our job is to undermine that power and undermine those lies.
We want to thank you, Nir Rosen, for your work and for this latest book, Aftermath, Following the Bloodshed of America's Wars in the Muslim World. He's a fellow at NYU Center on Law and Security. This is Democracy Now! When we come back from break, we'll be joined by filmmakers John Alpert and Matt O'Neill, talking about their latest film, War Torn. It'll air on Veterans Day on Thursday. It's about post-traumatic stress. Stay with us.